I thought most of my life that drinking and drugging was normal, and until I got introduced to a rehab to know that it's far from normal. My name's Jeff Amato, and I'm a proud Badgery man. I love the memories of growing up in Wellington. Where it took a turn was every day seeing drugs, alcohol use, just thinking that it was normal. I ended up in jail. You know, jails around Australia. It's a sad reality. Make a glass eye cry, the stuff that's going on in there. You know, jails didn't work for me. I knew if I went back to jail, I don't know if I'd have walked out them gates again. You know, what worked for me was a rehabilitation centre to deal with my trauma and my mental health, my addiction. And I'm fortunate enough to be just under 11 years total clean and sober, no alcohol, no drugs. This place taught me that, gave me the tools to live a productive life in society, you know, and yeah, I'm so grateful for that place. And you know, if something like that could be out this way in Dubbo, Wellington way, it's going to help community and families. The only way we can make change is if we have the right people in the right positions that are passionate about making change. We're not going to make change if you're not passionate about your position.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining us in this second of our 3 panel discussions on the case for a residential rehabilitation facility here in Dubbo and a drug court here in Dubbo. And thank you to the Dubbo Regional Council for bringing us together tonight to speak to this forum. My name is Joe Kellaway. If you missed out on the first panel, get online to Dubbo Needs a Rehab. We heard from some excellent speakers, including that most powerful message and the speaker of the message that you just heard, Jeff Amato, in the introduction. Those speakers gave us a rich and a raw and a real lived experience of coming to terms with adversity, addiction, grief, mental health issues. So you can get online to Dubbo Needs a Rehab to catch up on the first discussion. But tonight, before we commence, I'd like to first invite the local Badgery elder, Auntie Marg Walker, to the microphone for a welcome to country. Auntie Marg Walker.
Yuridu Marang, Yuandu Auntie Margaret, Dubbo D, Wiradjuri, Ina. It's a pleasure to be here to offer you a welcome to country tonight. And the country we're meeting on tonight is Willow Wiradjuri country. Willow's the possum, that's our totem for this area, and we're part of the Wiradjuri Nation. I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to elders past, present and future, for they hold our culture, our history and our memories, and also acknowledge the descendants of the 8 clan groups within Dubbo. And I'd just like to start by giving you our traditional welcome. Yinna Gullambu, Gibrabangbu, Guwayambanadu Nindugi, Wiradjuri, Nurumbangu, Wiradjuri Maini Garang. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Wiradjuri country, and Wiradjuri people are glad that you're here. So on behalf of all Aboriginal people, Willow Wiradjuri people, welcome to Willow Wiradjuri country, and have a great stay, great meeting tonight, and we do really need rehab here in Dubbo, drug and alcohol rehab. So welcome to Willow Wiradjuri country, everyone. Thank you. Guway you. Thank you.
Thank you to Auntie Marg Walker. So far we've reached, in our last broadcast, we've reached over 18,000 people. To remind you, the business case has been done for a facility. The Commonwealth has pledged $3 million to the building and the construction, and the council has allocated the land. As we move closer to the state budget, we are making the case for $2 million towards construction and $2.7 million ongoing, and the allocation of appropriate resourcing for the establishment of a drug court here in Dubbo. There's a lot to get through tonight, and I'll introduce our panel first. But to take the pledge and support your, to voice your support, please go to Dubbo Needs a Rehab. I might start by introducing the panel on the left of the screen and then work through the panel. We have with us tonight Mark Davies from the Crown Prosecutors Chambers in New South Wales. Mark is a barrister As a Crown Prosecutor, he appears as counsel on behalf of the Crown in serious and complex criminal matters in various jurisdictions. Mark also works part-time as a subject coordinator at the Charles Sturt University Bachelor of Laws course, lecturing in criminal procedure. He previously worked as a detective and a prosecutor with the New South Wales Police Force, an investigator with the Independent Commission Against Corruption, solicitor with the Office of Director of Public Prosecutions, and a solicitor with the Aboriginal Legal Service as well here in Dubbo. Mark holds a Master of Laws in Criminal Practice from the University of Wollongong, a Diploma in Law from the Legal Profession Admission Board, and an Advanced Diploma in Public Safety Police Investigations from CSU. He lives in the Dubbo area on a small farm where he has a young and seemingly growing family. Next to Mark, we have Bill Dickens from the Legal Aid Commission. Bill was born in Dubbo. He was admitted to practice as a solicitor in 1982. He's been a criminal lawyer for over 30 years, including working in the New South Wales Drug Court. He's been the solicitor in charge of the Dubbo Regional Legal Aid Office since 2012. Seated to my left is Anne Hazleton, who was born and raised on the family farm in Gilgandra, and her family continue to farm in the area. Anne was admitted to practice in 2003. Before that, she worked as a student at law. Anne has been a principal at Northern Badgery since 2007 and owned the practice since 2009. Before becoming a solicitor, she was a flight attendant for 11 years with Hazleton Airlines, later known as Rex. Anne practices in areas of law including conveyancing, succession, wills and estates, family provision, commercial law, family law, care and protection, and criminal law. Anne's husband is a pilot for Rex, and she has a son who is a local primary school. Anne has also been involved with Dubbo organisations including Meals on Wheels, Dubbo Bridge Club, and her son's various sporting activities. Lastly, we have the author of our business case, Mr. Patrick Shepherdson. Patrick is a social research consultant whose work primarily focuses on crime and violence prevention, alcohol and other drug recovery, post-release, reintegration, men's behaviour change, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander healing. He's been engaged by local, state and Commonwealth government agencies, as well as Aboriginal, philanthropic and other organisations across Australia to undertake research, develop community safety strategies, design service models and practice frameworks, and undertake program evaluations. Patrick has a master's degree in criminology through the University of Sydney and is a casual teaching fellow with the University of New South Wales, teaching undergraduate and postgraduate crime prevention policy. He's undertaken a body of work in partnerships with the Dubbo community over the years, including the development of the Dubbo Children in Prisons project, designed to reduce the detention of Aboriginal children and young people, undertaken on behalf of the Vincent Fairfax Family Foundation and the Dusseldorp Forum. The development of a policy framework and guidelines to support Council's recently expanded CCTV network, and the development of the business case and a service model for a residential alcohol and other drug rehabilitation facility on behalf of the Dubbo Regional Council. Could you please welcome our panel tonight? The business case that I've just referred to in introducing Mr. Shepherdson is available online. Dubbo Needs a Rehab, and it does not take that long to read, but it's a very important document, and I think that we're going to start there with you, Mr. Shepherdson. Although you've outlined a broad case for a residential facility here in Dubbo, I think we might start first with, in conducting your analysis and the people that you spoke to and your research in being in the area, if you can describe to us what are the main substances of concern and whether they correlate with each other, and what the real issues are with respect to different types of substances in this region.
Okay, Joe. So we spoke to close to 150 people across a whole range of services across both Dubbo and Wellington and community, and that we're talking justice and health and child protection and family services and tenancy services and housing services and financial counsellors, a lot of NGOs. And one of the questions we just explicitly ask people is, in terms of you and your work and your clients and the community you work with, what is the major drug or alcohol issue of concern? And hands down, that was alcohol. I think that in a lot of conversations, people actually forget about the impacts of alcohol. And people might often start talking about ice, which is quite topical, but when you say, but in terms of the impact, it definitely was alcohol. And the health workers also verified that alcohol is the single greatest cause of emergency admissions here. And then when you look at the crime data, and it's no surprise there's quite a relationship between alcohol and violence. And New South Wales Bureau of Crime Stats data, they don't always capture it, but they record when police have identified if alcohol's a factor. And alcohol was a factor in about a quarter of the domestic violence cases in that year, which we're looking at 2017 data, and about a third of the non-domestic assaults as well. So it's clearly an issue. Cannabis was also considered to be like the second most prevalent substance, but there was a kind of diversity of opinions around cannabis, in the sense of there were concerns that cannabis is so normalised to some extent that some people don't even consider it a drug. But in the conversation of rehab and of the other sort of negative social outcomes, there was general agreement that cannabis wouldn't be the focus of a residential rehab. And the studies actually sort of back that up in terms of saying that generally, while people might engage in rehab for cannabis, that would be more of a sort of outreach day kind of model. So crystal methamphetamine, which people call ice, came in as the sort of drug of concern behind alcohol in conversations. And when we're having those consultations, you'd had a close to 40% increase in, I think, detections or possession offences in the area at that point in time, in 2017. And that's a drug that's also associated with, violence, but also property offences. And, Dubbo does have disproportionately high levels of both of those types of crime. One thing that the health workers particularly flagged is that with the sort of rise in ice is that people tend to forget about heroin, but heroin is still a problem here. And in recent years, as we've all seen the opioid crisis in America, Australia's following that trend, and in your region, there was also concerns about, fentanyl, oxy, and just other forms of opioid drugs as well. And there's still, a significant number of people in the region, but also specifically in Dubbo, who are on opioid substitution treatment. So it's clearly an issue that would be considered in a rehabilitation. So, just generally those drugs are, associated, as I mentioned, with violence, with property crime. And, Dubbo, at that time in 2017, Dubbo was actually in the top 10 of New South Wales for some of those offences, and then had, higher levels than on other council areas as well.
And I think that dramatic increase that you referred to, about that 37% increase in the detection of amphetamine possession offences. So that's just the possession offences. That's
right. That doesn't talk about the other crimes.
Everything that's associated with that. And with respect to what you talked about, the opioid issues, the OxyContin or oxycodone, it's not just the abuse of that medication, but it's also the vulnerability of people who have access to it for legitimate reasons as well.
And that's actually a really good point that was teased out in some work I was doing in Sydney recently, where there was a conversation with someone who actually provides a opioid substitution service through a pharmacy, and the assumption that it's people still transitioning from heroin, and is in that community, and it's an well-to-do inner city community. Said the primary clients are people who were professionals who ended up with injuries, who were given opioid treatments, and so it is sort of one of those drugs that show that it's not the stereotype, I guess, of the sort of drug addict that people think about. That there's a whole lot of people that are vulnerable with the introduction of those sort of pain management pills.
And it's not just locally, as you point out in your business case. The Australian Crime Commission has deemed methamphetamine to be the illicit drug posing the greatest risk to the Australian community. And after that part of your report in terms of dealing with various substances, you make the correlation as to the impact of alcohol and other drugs on the broader Dubbo community. And the first part that we start with, I think that we'll start with tonight, is the well-known correlation between alcohol and drug abuse and crime, as you've already mentioned. With respect to, though, that increase in drug use and the difficulties with alcohol, has that correlated with what you describe as an over-representation or disproportionate representation of Dubbo with respect to the statistics on criminal offences?
Well, yeah, I think, like I mentioned earlier, the relationship with theft offences and certain crimes, and Dubbo at that stage, 2017, was more than 3 times the state average for theft offences. I'll have to review that again, but you were more than twice the rate for steal from motor vehicle and malicious damage offences, and close to twice the rate of the New South Wales average rate for both assault, domestic and non-domestic assault as well.
And in terms of those last offences, the offences of violence, you found that alcohol was one of the main features. I know.
Yes, so as I mentioned, that's the data we get in New South Wales. We've got fantastic data through the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, and they can actually just flag associated factors. And at that point in time, as I say, it was about 25% of your domestic assaults and close to a third, so like about 32% of the non-domestic assaults, from recollection, that had alcohol flagged as a factor. It's important to remember that that's not always captured, the relationship between alcohol and the crime, and it's also really important to remember that so many assaults go undetected, unreported, and particularly we know in terms of domestic assaults, we know that the data is not indicative of the true case.
It tells us what's been reported.
That's what's reported, or detected,
And looking at those sorts of figures, I think for the audience tonight and for people and our viewers watching at home, there's a lot of sentiments and expressions to the like of, rehabilitation can be something that can seem to be soft on crime, and really are we actually tackling the problem? And I think that would take me to bring it to you, Mark, Crown Prosecutor, and just to tell us, with that sort of sentiment of, we might be getting soft in crime, we should be incarcerating more people, incarcerating for longer until they get to the point, until the point gets through to them. In a sentence proceeding, either in the local or the district or the Supreme Court, what are the main features that a judge or a magistrate could be looking at and has to assess with respect to making the appropriate sentence?
Sure. Before I answer your question, I just want to make it clear that I'm here in my personal capacity, and anything that I say tonight isn't on behalf of the director. I'm here with my own experience, and I strongly urge a rehabilitation and detox facility to Dubbo. Answering your question, Joe, there are 2 main areas that the judge will look at when they're determining what the sentence might be. They look at the crime, so the actual act that the person committed, and they'll look at the person's circumstances. So when the judge is looking at the crime, they'll look at the nature of the crime, the seriousness of the crime, the maximum penalty of the crime, and they'll also look at the person that they're sentencing. They'll look at their background, they'll look at any issues that they might have, they'll look at their age, they'll look at any drug issues, any alcohol issues, any mental health issues. And those 3 issues, 99 times out of 100, will go hand in hand. The judges don't just pluck sentences out of the air. Parliament has passed legislation which constrain judges and tells judges what to look at. And Parliament has told judges that the purposes of sentencing are punishment, deterrence, both deterrence of the person and deterrence of the community, protection of the community, to promote rehabilitation, to denounce the offender's conduct, to make the offender accountable, and to recognise the harm done. So everything that the judge looks at in the sentencing process must hark back to one of those purposes of sentencing. Now, there's also law that's handed down from our higher courts, from the High Court and from the Court of Criminal Appeal, that the judges need to look at, and they'll often be with respect to specific issues. There's cases on murder and cases on dangerous driving and cases on drug addiction. So it's a really complicated process for judges, and often those purposes of sentencing will pull two different directions. But issues of drug and alcohol addiction and the mental health issues that go hand in hand affect each and every aspect of what it is that the judge needs to look at when they're coming up with a sentence.
But and also in balancing the protection of the community and the safety of the community, in the appropriate case, that also goes hand in hand with the rehabilitation of the offender. For example, one way to make the community safe for the next 6 months is to incarcerate the offender. They get released in 6, 12, whatever the term is. And some could argue that that doesn't necessarily achieve the protection of the community in the long run. And that's where the rehabilitation aspect of things starts to make a feature. But I think, as you said, it's a difficult task. How much more difficult is it made when you don't have the options or the tools that you'd like to have to confront, for example, a property crime, and you're looking at a person who needs intervention?
Much more difficult. The options for the judicial officer, whether it be a magistrate or a judge, are extremely limited when the structures aren't there to allow the judge to send somebody to rehab. As you said, Joe, protection of the community is a really important aspect of sentencing proceedings. And at first blush, having somebody locked away behind bars is a good way of keeping the community protected, but that's for a very short period of time. The better way of protecting the community is making sure that this person doesn't offend, can go into the community, can deal with their issues, whether it be drug or alcohol or mental health, become a functioning member of society, and the only way to do that is with the proper facilities and the proper funding and the proper resources for the judge, who is always an experienced judicial officer and an experienced human being, and can always determine when somebody needs treatment as opposed to incarceration. And when that treatment facility is not available, it pulls the rug out from under the judge.
Yeah, and I mean there are some offences that is a term of imprisonment. That's it. And almost everyone at the bar table is conceding. Well, people concede that this is a term of imprisonment. The authorities that talk to us say that this is a substantial term of imprisonment, and offences. There are offenders. We're not talking about every single offender in every single case. There's a range of seriousness that deal with incarceration for substantial periods of time. But below that bracket, there seems to be a range of cases and circumstances where it's almost a fork in the road, and it could go one way or the other. But here we're going down the incarceration route because the other route is simply blocked off.
It's blocked because there's no choice. The judge might think that it's the best thing for the community, it's the best thing for the offender, or even the best thing for the victim. But that judge hasn't got that option, so the person goes to jail.
And I'll just get to Bill Dickens in a minute, but and I know that you speak in your personal capacity, but you've also had that background of experience with the Aboriginal Legal Service as well, so you've been on both sides of the fence, in effect. But just to inform our viewers, the role of the Crown isn't like we see on sort of American criminal law drama. It is to, well, you're a Crown prosecutor. You could describe it better than me. But it's very much to present a fair analysis of what is in front of the court and to assist the court at arriving at the right sentence rather than take a sort of hardline approach.
That's right. The Crown was described a couple of years ago in a newspaper as attack dogs, and that's completely wrong. The Crown's duties are set out quite clearly in the bar rules, which are rules that all barristers must follow. And all barristers have a paramount duty to the court. But the prosecutor's duties go a step further. It's not for the prosecutor to struggle and strive for a conviction or for the longest sentence or to inflame the jury or the judge with emotion and passion. It's essentially to fairly assist the court to find the truth by putting the relevant evidence before the court and making reasonable submissions of law on a reasonable basis of fact.
So, and I think Bill Dickens, we've heard from, in that course of that conversation with Mark, we've got an idea of the orthodox current day criminal justice system and the court as it functions in the local district court. How is it that the drug court features as a different option to that kind of courtroom that we've been hearing about? How does the drug court come into it?
All right, drug court is one of two what I would call therapeutic approaches to sentencing within New South Wales. So one is the Compulsory Drug Treatment Correctional Centre, which is located at Parklea, and the other is drug court. And they operate in similar kinds, excuse me, in similar kinds of ways, in that they provide a different kind of sentencing process. And can I just put paid to the idea that these are soft options? These are not soft options, these are sensible options. And they're sensible because they're effective in reducing recidivism and reoffending. And in September of this year, the BOSCAR, the Bureau of Crime Statistics, reported on a study of the operations of the drug court over a considerable period of time and clearly made those findings. That is that the drug court was effective in reducing recidivism and reoffending rates. So these are sensible approaches to sentencing, not soft approaches to sentencing. And the thing about both of these things is that they are only available to persons who reside within a particular postcodes in New South Wales. So what we've had develop here is dual systems of justice, or what's quite often referred to as postcode justice. So if you happen to live in Western Sydney, or if you happen to live near to Toronto, or if you happen to live anywhere within the Sydney metropolitan area, you're going to be become more eligible for consideration of these programs. If you're out here, you don't get a look into either of them. Now, primarily tonight's about a rehab. You can't have a drug court without a rehab. You have to have a rehab for a drug court to function. But you've asked me, Joe, how drug court works, I think. So basically what happens with drug court is that persons who've pleaded guilty to crimes receive what's called an initial sentence. and they then go into a drug court program for a period of time, and that drug court program provides them with extremely close supervision and therapeutic support, and probably the closest kind of supervision that the criminal justice system can provide to an offender. There are regular reporting to the drug court. There is very close supervision of their activities. There is constant drug testing. And so a person agrees to a drug court program, and then they are released to the community in one way or another, and initially that will generally be, after a period in custody, to a therapeutic rehabilitation facility, and they go through a program there. And they then might advance after discharge from that to being more at liberty within the community. And so they advance. And quite often it will be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and people falter and things don't go swimmingly all the time. And so there is a system of carrots and sticks, so that if a person doesn't comply with their drug court program, they get things called sanctions, and things will be taken away from them. And if they're found to be using drugs, or if they're dishonest with persons administering the program, they receive what are called sanctions, 4 days sanctions. If a person gets 14 days sanctions, then they go back inside, and they go to a part of the prison that is specifically for use of drug court participants. If the drug court team think it appropriate, they might then be released on the program once again. Now, ultimately, if a person goes through this process and is successful, at the end of the process, the initial sentence that's been passed will be reconsidered. If a person has been totally successful, then quite often that prison sentence will then become a non-custodial penalty. And so in that way, drug court works towards the rehabilitation of a person. The Compulsory Drug Treatment Correctional Centre at Parklea works in a similar kind of way. Again, it's a therapeutic sentencing process. If you're lucky enough to live within the metropolitan area of Sydney, after you are sentenced, you can be referred to the drug court for consideration for this particular facility. And if you get a non-parole period no less than 18 months and a head sentence no more than 6 years, then you can be referred for assessment. If the drug court thinks that you're appropriately put in the program, then you go to Parklea, you serve time within a specialised part of Parklea, and then, again, you're released on a drug court program. And so this will provide an opportunity for early release. That's the carrot. Of course, if you fail to comply with your drug court program, again, that'll be terminated, and you'll go back and you'll serve the sentence that was imposed by the judge in the first place. So they work in slightly different ways, but both of them provide a very intensive support model, and in comparison to other remedies within the criminal justice system, there are people working with offenders who care about them and work closely with them and support them and assist them with their rehabilitation. So that's how those two systems in New South Wales work, but of course they aren't available to us here.
And in terms of not being available to us here, the numbers that you put in terms of the sentences for the compulsory drug treatment program, I think it's 18 months non-parole period, 6 years head sentence.
That's correct.
That is the common variety of offences, or the range of a lot of the work of a magistrate or in district court.
Well, that's so. I think currently 25% of sentences in New South Wales are in fact less than 2 years. 25% of prisoners are Aboriginal. So the greatest number of prisoners, I should say a third of prisoners on remand refuse bail, but the greatest number of prisoners are serving relatively short sentences.
And that's the kind of time, that length of sentence is the kind of time that a residential rehabilitation facility can properly go about its work. That sort of...
Well, that's so, and you don't need a drug court to have a residential rehabilitation facility, but you can't have a drug court without one. So the persons who are before drug court or in the compulsory drug treatment correctional centre are typically persons who have committed more serious crimes and are serving more lengthy sentences. But if you've got a residential rehabilitation facility, it's quite a simple process for a court to otherwise compel treatment. And so the use of bail orders, for example, can be used. If there is a rehab facility, a person can be compelled to remain in that facility by virtue of a bail order. And I can't tell you the amount of time that we spend trying to get people into such facilities, and it is so difficult, and there are so few available, and there's nothing available in our region.
And just lastly on the point, if we go back to where you started, Bill, with the notion of whether rehabilitation and intervention of this kind is a bit soft on the offender, as you say, in a drug court situation, the jail term is hanging over their head, and if they don't get through the program, the end of the road is incarceration. And some would argue that it's actually a much harder road for the individual to take than simply just going and serving the term and being released again.
Yes, that's the easy option.
Yeah.
Not these options that compel a person to look towards their rehabilitation and has that closely scrutinised. That's the hard option. The soft option is going in, doing nothing, getting released to the same old things.
Well, we're almost past halfway, ladies and gentlemen, and go online to Dubbo Needs a Rehab and pledge your support and look at the business case that's online. But I might move the discussion a bit away from the criminal law side of things for now, and returning just to you, Patrick. You also identified in your report the impact of drug and alcohol, the broader reach and the broader impact, and others would argue the more important impact that you found it to be having on the local community.
Yeah, that was actually really kind of interesting and, frankly confronting, I guess, in the sense of the relationship between drug and alcohol and pretty much every poor social outcome, but also the range of people who are impacted by it as well, beyond the person who may be using substances. So we met with people from the child and family sector, and there's a local NGO whose focus is, vulnerable children. And they said, pretty much as soon as we started discussion, we get 100 referrals a month, and every one of them is related to drug and alcohol. And, you know, a couple of years before this project, I was actually working, as I mentioned earlier, in Dubbo around a strategy to reduce kids going to detention. And, you know, at that stage, it was a suspicion from some people that, you know, kids were out on the street at night on drugs. And then when we actually talked to the people who work with those young people and some of the families, they said it's not the kids that are on drugs, it's actually the parents are on drugs, but the kids are being neglected as a result of that. So we looked at the data after hearing from people in that space, and, you know, it might need to explain that the regions for FACS who support child protection are very big. So you're in a region that goes all the way from Bathurst to Bourke. So this is beyond just Dubbo, but there are 15 regions in the state then, and this region was the second highest for reports of kids at risk. And it was basically exactly twice the New South Wales average rate of report for kids at risk as well. But then we went to talk to like a tenancy service. We talked to housing services. Tenancy service in the first 5 minutes said that drug and alcohol is a factor in 100% of our clients who are either evicted or who are at risk of being evicted. But when that conversation unpacked, it wasn't just the clients in their own houses, it was actually their family members often. So if people were drug or alcohol dependent, they would visit parents or other family members trying to demand money. If that money wasn't available or wasn't forthcoming, there was malicious damage, their homes were trashed, people were kicked out of them, out of their home. We spoke to financial counsellors from one of the NGOs, and they just said that a lot of older people have lost their life savings because they've got children who become drug dependent. Those children sometimes, you know, beg and demand and get money from them willingly, and sometimes they'll just steal it. And so people explained that, you know, drug use was a factor. The drug use of children was a factor in elder abuse in a lot of instances as well. Suicide and self-harm. I mean, Mark mentioned earlier, of course, that relationship between trauma and mental health and substance use is just so integrated. But one of the counsellors from one of the counselling services here said that 90% of their clients who are at risk of suicide have drug and alcohol issues. And another service said that it's that gave us data that suggested that, you know, that there's presence of drug and alcohol in 70% of suicides. So basically everyone we spoke to just said that not only is it, you know, it's not just crime, it's drug and alcohol is impacting a whole range of poor social outcomes, but it's not just the, you know, the drug user, or some people want to call them the drug offender, it's their parents, their families, their children. So it's just, you know, I suspect there's very few families that aren't impacted by drug and alcohol these days.
So, and Anne, that brings in you conveniently. Your practice is not just in the criminal law. Does that sort of broad impact across the spectrum, is that reflected, or how do you find that in your
Absolutely.
day-to-day work?
I say even in terms of doing wills, that probably these days if a family has 4 children, chances are that 1 in 4 of those children will have some form of addiction. That will mean that mum and dad, when they're settling their estate affairs, don't feel that they can leave it to all 4 children equally, that there needs to be some provision for the child who's drug and alcohol affected, or drug or alcohol affected, or has mental health problems, and they need some sort of protection into the future. Often when we start talking about that, there's an issue. Who do you leave as their trustee? Often their siblings are sick of them. I often see grandparents who are raising children. I have any number of clients who tell me that they, you know, I have some who are raising older grandchildren who tell me, one put it the other day, that they're not just not on the same planet, they're in totally different universes, because she was saying how difficult it was to go back and raise a teenage girl when she was in her 70s and had retired and was looking for a completely different life. And that, I always say to that particular person, to me, she's the epitome of the CWA lady. She had a family farm, she was a teacher, she brought up her own children. She had 4 boys, and one of those boys is what we'd call a frequent flyer in the criminal law system here in Dubbo. He had 3 children, and she's now raising 2 of those teenage children. And I see those people, you know, day in, day out. I have lots of people who have younger grandchildren, or nieces and nephews that they're looking after who have to put a lock on their kitchen door because the children were so neglected before they came to them that the kids still will break in, even though they're well fed now. They've got that great fear of being hungry, and they'll break into the kitchen in the middle of the night. So I see lots of things, and they've had traumas on those whole families because, as I said before, you know, often the siblings of the child who's the drug addict have a real problem with that addiction, or that, be it drugs or be it alcohol. They have an issue with that addiction and the fact that mum or dad or mum and dad have to do so much more for one particular child. So it's something I sort of see in lots of different contexts. I sometimes act for parents or grandparents in care and protection proceedings, and virtually all of those, as Patrick was saying, have a drug or alcohol or mental health connection. But also just generally in terms of wills and estates, in terms of how to make a will so that the child that has that drug or alcohol addiction is provided for, but so that there's some protections around that money. All those sorts of things are a daily part of my practice here in Dubbo. And I think the other thing that I'd like to talk about as well, Joe, is that we've all seen what's called Merit, which is the Magistrate's Early Referral into Treatment program that's been running in Dubbo for a very long period of time. And so for people who are dealt with by the local court, it's an option to go away and do some sessions with the Merit support workers to try and address their addictions, hopefully in early enough stages. And there's a lot of people who have benefited enormously from that Merit program. And I'm always really pleased if you deal with somebody in the criminal law and you never see them back again, because that means, and for a lot of those, Merit worked really, really well. But for some of them, they've got way beyond what Merit can do for them, and that's where we have that real need of a centre that can assist them. And for all of those people, one of the really important things is staying in touch with their family members. We often talk about pro-social supports in the criminal justice system, and that's about keeping people connected with their family, keeping people connected with their community, so that there's a reason for them to reform.
The reason I was nodding when you just finished there, because I was being told that we're getting closer to our cut-off time this evening. We have covered a lot of ground, but before I come back to you, and if we could take questions now, but we're getting close to the 10-minute mark, so if there are people in the audience who do have a question, or if you're at home and you want to send a question in to any of the panellists, please do so. Get online. Dubbo needs a rehab. But people in the audience tonight can think about whether they want to put a question to any of the panellists before we wrap it up tonight. But just in terms of the clients across the board who have these issues, as Patrick said, outside the criminal law, and how it affects people that depend on them or people who have to look after them, this option of having a full-time, well, two facilities really, a detox facility dedicated to detoxification, which we don't have here in Dubbo, and residential rehabilitation facility here in Dubbo. Is it the kind of thing that you think you would keep secret from your clients, aside from the criminal law clients, or is it something that would likely feature when you're speaking to your clients across the board?
I deal with a very diverse range of clients, and I can tell you that there are very few families in Dubbo who, if they were honest, would say that they're untouched by it. It might be, the very wealthy landowner who's always had a problem with alcohol, who one day his wife just goes, "I can't cope anymore." And I'm sure there are times when you'd love to have that option to say there is an option out there. This is something that you need to look at, is how to get them into this sort of help, because at the moment there's very little available.
Yeah, and I think they're sober in the country. have a lot of experiences about the problem with alcohol in regional, rural communities and the isolation of individuals. And Hello Sunday Morning is another organisation, although it's come from the city, it sort of seems to have expanded out into the country. But even something that is completely unexpected, for example, the sudden or tragic death by accident of a family member, where individual, like the family, rallied together, and then, as you say, one child or a number of people in the family have a resurgence of a problem, and then the family is dealing with it for years to come in ways that they never expected. Do we have questions from the audience? We have a shy audience. They're all listening to us very intently. We might come back to our... All right. We do have a gentleman in the audience who wishes to ask a question. Could we get a microphone to him, please? Or you can say where he is and I can repeat it.
Yeah, hi. Just a question for anyone, really. I was curious whether you've got any thoughts about the particular model that we could have in terms of a rehab and detox centre here in Dubbo, and particularly if people are aware of any models where they provide educational and training opportunities and employment opportunities after people go through the course.
Thank you. And I might take that to you, Pat, and you did a lot of analysis of other facilities.
Yeah, so we actually spoke to 6 rehab service providers and also did a lot of other research as well. And I mean, everyone's got a different kind of therapeutic practice, I guess, in their approach, and programs all have different elements, but the conversations made it clear that you don't actually need to define one very prescriptive model because everyone has a different need in terms of healing and recovery. The need for recognising that this is not just a matter of you go to rehab, you fix, you get out. People really emphasise that the front end is very important because so many people want to get in but they can't get there, or because of the lack of detox and people have to travel long distances, they have to home detox, and then they're travelling when they're very vulnerable after home detoxing, and they might have to actually travel overnight or wait somewhere to actually get to a rehab, and then they can actually end up using drugs because it's a very confronting thing. So really focusing on the front end. In terms of the in reach or within the program, it was great to hear last week from the panel. They said what a lot of local Aboriginal health and other service providers said as well, is the sense that this needs to be an inclusive facility in this community, but one that actually can support healing for Aboriginal people as well. And so that's what we've sort of designed here. There's models around in terms of there's men's healing programs in Victoria that we've spoken to. There's an Aboriginal specific bush healing farm that's recently started in the ACT, and sometimes they'll actually have men's or women's groups within the programs. The one in Canberra was actually designed to actually give people a pathway not just to healing from trauma and recovery from drug use, but then into employment. So it was actually built as a farm, like they purchased land with a view to giving people that vocational pathway. So, I've suggested in the business case that these things should all be considered, but it shouldn't be assumed that one service has to do all of those things. Because that's the beauty of being in Dubbo, is that you've actually these days got a pretty good service infrastructure. The modern, contemporary approach is to actually look at, what they call a person-centred recovery. So you go through a process of identifying what everyone's individual needs are. Some people aren't going to be actually able to move into a pathway of employment. There are some people who realistically a good outcome is they actually get up in the morning and they don't want to self-harm. But there are other people who can actually sort themselves and then move into a successful life. So having good partners to provide those pathways, and really importantly at the end for reintegration, because it's very hard, particularly for people who might come from a community where the drug use or alcohol use is rife. It could be rife within their family. So to actually really walk with people when they get back into community and make sure you've got, so we suggested 2 kind of support workers here to actually follow up with people out on the ground, because we've got so many systems, in Australia where You might come out of a juvenile detention centre, and young people in detention, clearly that's an alarm bell that they're in crisis, and then they've got to go back to a community, and they could be 800 kilometres away from a support worker when they've come out. So if you want to do it, it's, you know, good to try and do it properly, I guess.
And just following on from that question, there's a related question that's come through the Facebook site from Rick Lean. And can we ask about the model containing a support system for family members who are left with the addicted person once released? And it's a part of that exit strategy.
And I mean, it is, the conversations here sort of talked about the fact that, you know, and a lot of Aboriginal community members and families will talk about a kind of whole family-based approach, but that can be quite challenging in terms of, you know, having, you know, the idea that you might have children in a space where you might have people who are convicted offenders. And so you need the time for that individual to do their own kind of personal healing. But if you could partner with a family service that could actually work with the family and keep them okay while the other parent is actually in rehab, and then try and do some sort of family reunification or some sort of strengthening. That's an approach like in Victoria around family violence. The government there at the moment is actually trialling an approach where they have a mandated program for men who have perpetrated violence, but then they've got a family support program to wrap around the partners and children. So there are models around that you can draw from, but you just, you know, obviously, ideally you'll get a rehab and you'll have a rehab facility with people who actually, you know, are across these examples and can actually have the relationships. Obviously it would be up to everyone in the community to try and pull together and get behind that, but you do need just strong partnerships to actually work with the family.
And I think one of the things you said to me before we came on air this afternoon, getting the person actually there to the facility can be just as important as the time that they spend there, which can be just as important as the exit strategy as well. So that it's not just the time at the facility itself. It starts from the start and end at the home.
There's a saying I've heard from so many Aboriginal people I've worked with around the country, that healing is a journey. That this is not a quick fix, and that's quite a different construct. And this is not talking about a service here that's exclusively Aboriginal, but there's, you know, the service in Orange, the Lives Lived Well, they said more than 50% of their clients are Aboriginal. And so it's quite different in that sense of healing compared to a sort of Western construct of disease and cure. It's not like that. People actually are in recovery. You know, it's for life. You just need to learn to manage behaviour, manage yourself, have those strategies to de-stress in a safe way, and just keep that eye on the ball.
And if you want to see or read some more about that gives a more detailed answer to the questions that we've been asked, Patrick does point out throughout his report and his business case about the kinds of structures and the vocational training and vocational intervention skills, basic skills, trade skills and the like, that it's not just the isolation of an individual, their abstinence, and then releasing them, but it's a holistic kind of intervention to effectively skill them for their reintroduction to the community, from basic skills to trade professional skills. And I commend the report to you, but we are running out of time. And ladies and gentlemen at home and in the audience, please get on to the Dubbo Needs a Rehab and sign the pledge when you can, and the petition. But if nothing has persuaded you from our panel last week or the panel tonight, and you still feel that you're not quite there with respect to the case, even the Scroogest of bean counters amongst us, when you look at the numbers, and I think we might finish on this, would tell you that the cost-benefit analysis of what we're talking about tonight is very much in all of our interests. And Pat, you focused on that near the end of your report.
Yeah, like it's not a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, but we just looked at the literature that was there, looked at data that was available that was comparable from 2014, which found that the cost then, the average cost to incarcerate a person in Australia at that point in time was $109,500. And by comparison, the average cost for residential drug treatment was around $17,300. Now, when you say that, we do need to note that the data suggests that residential rehab is successful on about 50% of occasions, but then other people can succeed on that second try. But another really interesting study, though, was actually done by Deloitte Access Economic, and this was published by the Australian National Council on Drugs. But it was a study where they actually did a cost-benefit analysis of the impacts of residential rehab versus incarceration for Aboriginal people with problematic drug use. And that study actually found savings of $111,458 per offender, and that was in terms of sort of justice, my understanding, but it said that was in addition to improvement in terms of health and mortality. So it's actually really good to start seeing those kind of, big companies actually doing cost benefits of these sort of approaches, which often haven't been evaluated well for Aboriginal people. So there's some, as I say, people need to be mindful. And also, when I mentioned 50% of people, it was estimated 50% of people complete or succeed from residential rehabilitation. There are always people who can't do residential rehab, people who can't leave family responsibilities, or people who's perhaps with mental health issues that mean that they can't really go into a residential or group setting. So you do need to try and keep up those options for other people as well. But this suggests that it is in every taxpayer's interest to actually invest in rehab.
And it's the taxpayer that goes to the ballot, and it's the government that we are asking in the next budget to send the funds our way. As I've said at the start, the Commonwealth already has, the Council's allocated the land, and we are looking for a specific funding and recognition of these issues in the next state budget. With respect to a rehabilitation facility, a detox facility, and a drug court here in Dubbo. I'd like to thank our panel members who are here tonight. I'm sorry, but we have run out of time. Could you please thank Pat Shepherdson, Anne Hazleton, Bill Dickens and Mark Davies. Please watch this space. There'll be a third discussion to come with a panel that will hopefully take a different focus on some of the medical issues that could be involved in this kind of facility. But thank you for being here tonight and being part of our discussion, and for your support in being our audience. The questions that you have, and you can keep the questions coming and we can answer them as they come in through the Facebook site. If you haven't already, get on to Dubbo Needs a Rehab. But thank you very much for being with us this evening, and good night.